turkey was already on the table when my brother walked through the front door in his dress uniform. I remember standing at the kitchen counter holding a serving spoon I'd forgotten to put down, just watching everyone's faces light up. My mother made a sound I can only describe as relief, like she'd been holding her breath for 3 years and finally let it go. My father stood up from his chair slowly, the way he does when something matters too much for him to rush. My brother, Nathan, stood in the doorway with his shoulders square and his chin up, and every single person in that room looked at him like he was the answer to a prayer. My husband was the only one who didn't move. I noticed it the way you notice a skipped beat in a song you know by heart. Everyone else surged forward, my mother grabbing Nathan's arm, my dad clasping his hand, my aunt pulling out her phone to take a photo. And Joel just sat there, very still, with his hands around his water glass and his eyes on my brother's chest. Joel works for the Department of Defense. He's been a federal investigator for 11 years. He doesn't talk about most of what he does, and I've learned not to ask. But I know his tells. I know what it looks like when something snags his attention and won't let go. After dinner, while Nathan was holding court in the living room telling a story about his unit that had everyone leaning in, Joel found me in the kitchen. I was wrapping up the leftover stuffing, and he came and stood beside me and spoke very quietly, the way he does when he means it. He said, "Something's off." I kept my hands moving. "What do you mean?" "The unit patch on his sleeve, the service ribbons, the order of precedence is wrong." He paused. "I could be mistaken, but I'd like to look into it." I set down the foil. I turned to look at him, and I said the thing I would later wish I hadn't said, because it wasn't fair, and I knew it wasn't fair even as I said it. "Joel, that's my brother." He looked at me with an expression that wasn't hurt and wasn't firm. It was something in between. He said, "I know. Nathan is 4 years older than me. Growing up, he was the kind of big brother who felt more like a landmark than a person. You just oriented yourself around him. He was loud in the way our family valued football games, backyard barbecues, the first one to laugh and the last one to leave. He could talk to anyone. He had friends in 3 different zip codes. When he enlisted at 22, our parents acted like it was the most Nathan thing he'd ever done, which it probably was. He did 2 years, then re-enlisted. He came home for holidays changed in small ways, quieter at the edges, more deliberate. We all read it as maturity, the natural result of service and sacrifice in growing up. When he got out, he told us he'd served 7 years total, honorably discharged. A combat veteran who'd been deployed twice. He talked about it in pieces, never a full account, just fragments. A base in Kandahar, a guy from his unit named Torres who made everyone laugh. The heat that never quit. We believed him. Of course we believed him. He was Nathan. He moved back to our hometown after getting out and took a job at a logistics company. He joined the local VFW post. He went to the Veterans Day parade every year and stood with the other men who'd served, and our father always pointed him out with a hand on my arm like I might miss him in the crowd. That was 5 years of my life, watching my brother be the family hero. And then Joel stood in my kitchen and told me something was off. I didn't sleep well that night. Nathan was staying in my old bedroom. My parents still kept it more or less intact, which I'd always found both touching and slightly strange. I lay in bed in the dark and listened to the house settle, the old pipes and the creak of the floorboards, and I thought about the way Joel had looked at Nathan's chest. Joel wasn't careless. He wasn't the kind of person who said things to be dramatic. If anything, he undersaid things. He'd had years of training to do exactly that, to hold information close, to wait until he was sure. The fact that he'd said anything at all meant he was already more than half certain. I told myself I didn't want to know. I told myself that even if something was slightly off with the ribbons, it didn't mean anything. Maybe Nathan had gotten confused about the order. Maybe the uniform was old. Maybe Joel was wrong. I said all of this to myself very carefully, And then I lay there until 3 a.m. thinking about Torres, the guy from Nathan's unit who made everyone laugh. Nathan had mentioned him 4 or 5 times over the years, specific enough to feel real, not specific enough to be verifiable. Joel didn't bring it up again for 2 weeks. I appreciated that, even though part of me wanted someone else to carry the weight of the question. What he did instead was research. He didn't tell me he was doing it. I found out because I came home early from work one afternoon and found him at the kitchen table with his laptop, and he closed it in a way that wasn't quite fast enough. I sat down across from him. He looked at me for a moment. Then he opened the laptop again. I need you to decide, he said, if you want to know. I looked at the ceiling. I looked at my hands. I thought about my mother's face when Nathan walked through the door. That sound she made, like relief. Tell me, I said. He showed me what he'd found. Nathan had enlisted. That was true. He'd served. That was true. But the record showed 2 years, not 7. He'd been discharged in 2011, not 2016. The discharge was not honorable. Joel pulled up the code and looked at me to make sure I understood. I understood. Nathan hadn't been deployed. He hadn't been to Kandahar. The combat veteran status, the service ribbons on his uniform, the stories about Torres and the heat that never quit. All of it was built on top of 2 years that ended badly, and then 5 more years of silence that he'd filled in with something else entirely. I sat at that table for a long time. Joel didn't say anything. He just sat with me. Finally, I said, "Does it matter? I mean, does it legally matter?" Joel said, "Depends on whether he's received benefits he wasn't entitled to, whether he's misrepresented himself for financial gain." He paused. The VFW post. I thought about my father pointing Nathan out in the Veterans Day parade, his hand on my arm. "Look at your brother." "I need to talk to him," I said, "before anyone else." Joel nodded. He closed the laptop again. He said, "I know." I called Nathan the next day and asked if he wanted to get lunch. "Just the two of us," I said. "I've been meaning to catch up," I said. He said, "Sure, of course," sounded like fun. I chose a diner 20 minutes from my parents' house, far enough that we wouldn't run into anyone we knew. I got there early and took a booth in the back and ordered coffee I didn't drink. When Nathan walked in, he was wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, no uniform, and he looked so much like my brother, my actual brother, the one I grew up with, that I almost talked myself out of it again. He slid into the booth across from me, grabbed the laminated menu, said, "You eating or just judging me while I eat?" like he always did, and I laughed before I could stop myself. We ordered. We talked about my parents, his job, the drive. He asked about my parents, his job, the drive. He asked about Joel. I said Joel was good. Then the food came, and Nathan started eating, and I looked at my plate and said, "I need to ask you something." He kept eating. "Shoot." "How did you get the combat veteran designation?" The fork stopped. Not dramatically. Just a small pause, half a second, before he set it down deliberately on the edge of the plate. He didn't look up right away. When he did, his face was careful. Not surprised. Careful. Like someone who'd been waiting for a particular knock on the door and finally heard it. "What are you asking me exactly?" "I'm asking you about your discharge, about your service record." I kept my voice level. I'd practiced this. Joel looked into it. Something moved across his face that I couldn't name. Not anger. Something heavier than anger. He picked up his coffee cup, put it down without drinking, looked out the window at the parking lot, the gray November afternoon, a woman pushing a cart back to her car. "How much does he know?" Nathan asked finally. "Enough." Silence. "I'm not going to lie to you," he said. "Not anymore. I'm so tired of it. You don't even know." And then, not all at once, not in any order I could have anticipated. He told me he'd enlisted at 22, like we all knew, but the second year was a disaster. He'd gotten in with people he shouldn't have. He was young and reckless and made a series of decisions that compounded on each other the way bad decisions do. He'd been caught in a situation that ended his service. The discharge was for misconduct. He came home in 2011 and couldn't figure out how to tell our parents that their son, the one they'd watched walk out the door with his shoulders square, hadn't managed to hold it together. So he didn't. He told them he'd re-enlisted. He put 5 more years into the story, year by year, deployment by deployment. He studied military culture obsessively to fill in the gaps. Torres was real. A guy he'd been in basic with who actually deployed, whose stories Nathan had borrowed and worn like a coat. The VFW post, he said, had been the worst mistake. He hadn't meant for it to go that far. But by the time he joined, the story was so established and the men there welcomed him so completely, and he couldn't find the moment to turn back. He hadn't drawn any benefits. He was careful about that, he said. Like, that was the line. Like, that was what made it still survivable. He said, I know that doesn't make it okay. I know that. I sat across from my brother in that diner booth and I tried to find the right thing to feel. There wasn't a right thing. There was just the full weight of all of it. The Veterans Day parades, our father's hand on my arm, our mother's relief when he walked through the door in the uniform he hadn't earned. You let us believe in something that wasn't real, I said. I know. For years. I know. Dad talks about you like, I stopped. I pressed my thumb against the corner of my eye. You have no idea what this is going to do to them. He looked at me, and he looked old suddenly. Older than his years. He said, I've been watching them believe it for so long, and I couldn't stop it. And I couldn't tell the truth, and it got heavier every year. I started drinking more. I don't know if you noticed. I had noticed. I hadn't said anything. I'm not asking you to protect me, he said. I need you to understand that. I'm not sitting here asking you to keep a secret. I'm sitting here because I've been wanting someone to know, the real version, for a very long time, and you're the person I trust. I drove home slowly. Joe was in the kitchen making soup, something he does when he's worried, and when I walked in, he looked at my face and turned the burner down. I sat at the table. He brought me a glass of water. He sat across from me and waited. I said, he told me everything. Okay. He doesn't want us to cover it up. He said he'd talk to our parents himself. Joel was quiet for a moment. And the post? I think he knows that has to be addressed. I looked at the water glass. He was never supposed to be the family hero. We made him that. He was 22 and scared, and he made a terrible choice, and then he spent 15 years drowning in it. That doesn't excuse it, Joel said quietly. No, it doesn't. I paused. But it explains it. We sat together for a while. Outside the window, the last of the light was going gray. Nathan told my parents on a Sunday in December. He drove to their house and asked if they could all sit down together. And he told them. I wasn't there for it. He'd asked me not to be, and I understood. Some things you have to carry yourself. My mother called me that evening. She cried. Not the kind of crying that sounds like grief, but the kind that sounds like someone trying to get their bearings in a room that's shifted slightly on its foundation. She kept saying, I don't understand how long, like the length of it was the part she couldn't fit into anything she knew. My father didn't call. He texted me 3 words, I need time. I wrote back, I know. I love you. The conversation with the VFW post was Nathan's to have, and he had it. I don't know everything that was said in that room. He came out of it with a list of things to do, ways to make amends that were real rather than symbolic. He started attending a counselor, a VA-affiliated therapist who worked with veterans and also, it turned out, with people who'd complicated relationships with service and identity. I don't know all of what they talk about. He stopped drinking, not dramatically, not in a way he announced. He just quietly stopped, and I noticed and didn't say anything, and then eventually told him I'd noticed. He said it was making everything worse. Christmas that year was quiet. My parents' house felt different in a way I couldn't fully describe. Not worse, exactly. More honest, maybe. Like furniture that had been in the wrong arrangement for years and had finally been moved. My father shook Nathan's hand when he arrived. Not a hug, a handshake, firm, with eye contact. I watched it from across the room and understood it completely. It was the language of two men trying to find their way back to each other across something that hadn't fully been mapped yet. My mother made Nathan's favorite pie. She didn't make a speech about it. She just put it on the table. Joel sat next to me on the couch after dinner, our shoulders touching, and he said quietly, "How are you doing?" I thought about it honestly before I answered. "Better than I expected," I said. "Worse than I hoped." He nodded. He understood. "It's been a little over a year now. Nathan and my father call each other on Sundays. Short calls, usually, but regular. My mother asked Nathan to come to her church's Veterans Day service, and then corrected herself. And then they both sat with that for a minute. And then Nathan said he'd come anyway, just as himself. He did. He sat in the back pew in a flannel shirt and jeans, no uniform, and when the congregation stood for the reading of names, he stood too. I know that's not a tidy resolution. I know some people would want the story to end differently, more consequence, or more absolution, or something cleaner. But this is what actually happened, in a family where people loved each other imperfectly and tried, in the end, to find their way back to something real. The uniform is gone. What's left is Nathan, just Nathan, the actual person, which is both less than what we imagined and more than we gave him credit for. I still don't know exactly when I stopped grieving the version of him I thought I knew and started appreciating the one sitting across from me. But it happened. It happened quietly, the way most true things do. I keep coming back to the moment Joel set down his water glass and said, "Something's off." 2 words. No accusation, no drama. Just a quiet observation from a man who'd spent his career learning to see what other people trained themselves not to. That's the part that stays with me. Not the confrontation in the diner. Not my father's 3-word text. Not even Nathan's face when he finally told the truth. It's that small, steady moment where someone chose honesty over comfort and trusted me enough to hand it to me gently. Nathan made a terrible choice at 22. I'm not going to minimize that. He lied to our parents, to his community, to men who had actually served and bled and come home changed in ways he only pretended to understand. That is real harm. The consequences of it, the fracture in our family, the work he had to do with the VFW post, the Sunday phone calls with our father that started stiff and formal and took months to soften. None of that happened by accident. It happened because actions compound. A small lie left unaddressed doesn't stay small. It grows its own structure, its own supporting details, its own weight. Nathan didn't just lie once. He built a second life on top of the first and spent 15 years maintaining it. And the cost of that maintenance was everything. His drinking, his anxiety, his inability to be fully present in any room where people admired him. What I understand now, watching him on the other side of it, is that the lie hurt him as much as it hurt us. Maybe more. Because we got to grieve something real, the version of him we thought we knew. He had to grieve the version of himself he'd wanted to be, the one who shipped out and came home with something to show for it. He was 22 and ashamed and didn't know how to say so. That doesn't excuse it, but it explains the mechanism. When people don't have the courage to face the truth early, they build walls around it, and eventually they're living inside the walls and can't remember what it felt like to breathe in the open. Joel has this quality I've always quietly admired. He doesn't react, he observes. He waits until he understands something fully before he says it out loud. That's not coldness, that's discipline, the kind that comes from years of choosing accuracy over assumption, even when assumption would be easier. I think about that when I catch myself wanting to believe the comfortable version of something. Joel's example, more than anything he's ever said to me directly, taught me that real intelligence isn't knowing a lot of things. It's being willing to look at what's actually there, even when it costs you something. And Nathan showed me something about endurance I didn't expect. Not the kind of endurance that looks like strength from the outside, the other kind. The kind that finally says, I'm exhausted, and puts down the weight it's been carrying, and stands there, empty-handed, and lets people see it. That took more out of him than any story he ever told about himself. He walked into my parents' house in December without a uniform, without a prepared answer, with nothing but the truth and whatever came next. I don't know if I could have done the same. I'm still figuring out what to do with all of it. The love is still there. It didn't go anywhere, but it's resting on a different foundation now, one that's been tested and cracked and rebuilt. That kind of love is harder to carry. It's also harder to lose.